I don't know what neighborhood you crawled out of, but you don't belong in here. Get up, slowly." Those words hung in the still morning air of Hargrove Grill like smoke that wouldn't clear spoken by a man with a badge on his chest, and 17 years of unchecked authority behind his eyes directed at a person he had already decided was guilty of something. He just hadn't figured out what yet, but we'll get to that. Rewind 47 minutes. Hargrove Township sat exactly 38 miles outside the state capital, the kind of suburb where the oak trees were old enough to have witnessed everything and said nothing, where the sidewalks were pressure washed every spring, and where the neighborhood watch treated an out-of-county license plate the way a guard dog treats a stranger at the gate, with immediate instinctive suspicion dressed up as civic duty. The streets curved gently past boutique coffee shops, a farmer's market that ran year-round, and law offices with brass plaques on mahogany doors. It was beautiful quiet and insulated in the particular way that money and homogeneity tend to insulate a place not with walls, but with the invisible assumption that certain people simply did not end up here by accident. The state, meanwhile, was not quiet at all. For the better part of 6 months, a police reform bill had been working its way through the legislative process with the slow, grinding energy of something that people desperately needed but weren't sure they were ready to accept. The bill addressed use of force thresholds, body camera mandates, complaint transparency, and most controversially, the removal of qualified immunity protections for officers found to have violated civil rights under the color of law. It had supporters and enemies in equal ferocious measure, and it was scheduled for a full floor vote in less than 8 days. The man carrying the bill, the man who had spent the last 14 months of his life building the legal architecture of it paragraph by careful paragraph, was currently driving a black Cadillac CT6 down Hargrove's perfectly paved main road with 47 minutes to spare before he needed to be anywhere. He had not planned to stop at the diner, but the breakfast meeting had ended early. The highway back to the Capitol was backed up from an early morning accident, and the smell of coffee and something warm drifted through his cracked window as he slowed at the light. He pulled into the lot. He had no idea the next 47 minutes would do more for his bill than 14 months of hearings ever could. Senator James Caldwell was 54 years old, though people tended to guess younger until they looked closely at his eyes, which carried the particular weight of a man who had spent 3 decades watching institutions fail the people they were supposed to serve, and then choosing every single morning to walk back inside those institutions and try to fix them anyway. He had grown up in the Eastgate district, the kind of neighborhood that Hargrove Township residents only drove through when GPS made a mistake the son of a school principal and a man who repaired appliances and quoted Thurgood Marshall at the dinner table. James had put himself through law school on scholarship, and Grit spent 12 years as a civil rights attorney, taking cases that didn't pay well, but mattered enormously. And then at 41 made the decision to run for state senate because he was tired of fighting the law from outside it. He had won by 11 points and had not stopped winning since. This particular Tuesday morning, he was dressed in a charcoal suit with a faint chalk stripe, a white shirt, a black tie, and the gold watch his father had left him. Simple heavy, the kind of watch that announced nothing and meant everything. His leather briefcase, worn smooth at the corners from years of use, sat in the passenger seat. Inside it, 47 pages of the police reform bill's most recent draft, annotated in the margins with his own handwriting, a notebook, 2 blue pens, and the breakfast he hadn't eaten because the country club meeting had served only coffee and pastries so small they seemed apologetic about existing. He stepped out of the car, adjusted his cuffs, a habit not vanity, and walked toward the diner's glass door. The bell above it chimed when he pushed it open. Hargrove Grill was the kind of place that had been exactly the same for 30 years. Black and white checkered tile floor, leather booths, the color of burnt caramel, a long counter with chrome stools and windows along the front wall that caught the morning light and threw it across the room in warm amber rectangles. The smell was coffee and bacon and something sweet baking somewhere in the back. And for a moment, stepping inside, James felt something close to peaceful. He chose the corner booth near the window, placed his briefcase on the vinyl seat beside him, and pulled out the thick stack of briefing papers. He clicked his pen and set it on the table. A young woman appeared with a menu and a tired smile that had the shape of something genuine underneath the fatigue. Her name tag read Diane. "Morning. Coffee to start. Black, please, Diane." James said, his voice a low, easy baritone. "And a slice of whatever pie you've got that's worth eating this early." Diane laughed, a real one small but actual cherry. "And it's always worth it." She left. James turned to page 1 of the bill and began to read. For 10 minutes, the world was completely peaceful. Officer Dale Pruitt arrived at Hargrove Grill at 7:31 a.m., which was the same time he arrived every Tuesday and Thursday morning because he liked the coffee, and he liked the way Greg, the manager, always had his cup ready before he reached the counter, and because this diner, like this entire township, felt like his in the way that a man feels ownership over territory he has patrolled long enough to memorize. Pruitt was 46 years old with thinning blonde gray hair cut close to his skull, a face that had been weathered into a permanent expression of mild resentment, and a body that had thickened over 17 years of patrol work into something solid and heavy under his tactical vest. His jaw was almost always set, not clenched, just held like a man perpetually ready to be argued with. He was not, by any standard anyone would openly apply, an extraordinary officer. His arrest record was high. His commendations were plentiful, and his complaint file was the longest of anyone in the Hargrove Township Police Department, which was itself not a particularly large department. Complaints had been filed against him by a teenage boy who said Pruitt had slammed his head against a cruiser hood for asking why he was being stopped, by a woman who said Pruitt had called her a word she would not repeat in writing, by a man who said Pruitt had confiscated cash during a roadside stop and never logged it. None of these complaints had gone anywhere meaningful. The union was good at its job, and the previous captain had a philosophy about loyalty that made paperwork disappear. Pruitt nodded at Greg, who slid a cup across the counter without being asked. The usual Mitch. "Thanks, Greg." Pruitt picked up the cup and let his eyes do what they always did when he entered a space sweep. It categorized, it settle on anything that didn't fit the expected pattern. The retirees with their newspapers, the construction foreman splitting a stack of pancakes, the waitress moving between tables with a coffee carafe, and then his eyes stopped. Corner booth, black man, early 50s suit that cost more than most people's car payments, a leather briefcase, papers spread across the table, reading glasses he'd just pushed up his nose, out-of-county plates on the Cadillac parked directly in front of the window. Pruitt took a sip of coffee and watched. The irritation that moved through him in that moment was not a simple thing, and it would be wrong to reduce it to a single cause, but at its core, it was this: Pruitt had spent 17 years cultivating a sense of this township as a place where he understood the order of things, who came here, why they came where they fit. And the man in the corner booth did not fit the map Pruitt carried in his head. It wasn't the suit. Pruitt respected money. It wasn't even the car. It was the way the man was sitting upright, unhurried, occupying the space as if he had every right to be there without having asked anyone's permission. That ease in a township Pruitt considered his felt like a provocation. He set his cup down. He started across the checkered floor. Diane noticed first. She was refilling this coffee carafe at the warming station near the counter when she saw Pruitt bypass the stool where he usually sat and begin walking that particular walk she recognized slow and deliberate, and carrying weight it didn't need to carry toward the corner booth. She had worked at Hargrove Grill for 2 years. She had watched Pruitt come in twice a week for all of them. She had never once seen him approach a white customer the way he was approaching this man right now, which meant she already knew something about how this morning was going to go before a word had been spoken. She put the carafe down instead of picking it back up. At the booth near the front window, a 16-year-old boy named Tyler Okafor was finishing what had been, until 30 seconds ago, a fairly routine Tuesday breakfast: a bowl of oatmeal with brown sugar, a glass of orange juice, headphones around his neck, backpack leaning against the booth beside him. He was a junior at Hargrove Prep on a partial academic scholarship, and he took the 8:05 bus every morning from 2 blocks up the road. He had been looking at his phone when the movement in his peripheral vision made him look up. He watched Pruitt cross the room. He didn't look back down at his phone. At the corner booth, James Caldwell turned a page of the reform bill, and his eyes moved across Section 4, Paragraph 2, the section dealing with excessive use of force, the section he had rewritten 3 times to make it airtight, and his pen moved slowly, adding a note in the margin. The footsteps got closer. James didn't look up. He had heard that kind of footstep before, heavy and purposeful, and aimed at him more times in his life than he cared to count. And he had learned over decades that looking up too quickly gave people the impression that you were rattled, and he was not rattled. He was not and had not been for a very long time. He finished the sentence he was reading. He waited. The shadow fell across the table at 7:33 a.m. Pruitt stopped at the edge of the booth without announcing himself, without the standard courteous opener that any reasonable interaction might begin with, and simply stood there in a way that was designed to fill a space and crowd a person and remind them, without a single word, that the man with the badge and the utility belt got to decide how this went. His hand rested on his belt near the taser, not on it, not reaching for it, just near it, in the casual way that was not casual at all, but was instead a language all its own, one that said, "I have options here that you do not." James looked up. Their eyes met. Pruitt had expected the usual range of responses, a startled blink, a nervous clearing of the throat, a reaching for a wallet before being asked, an overeager smile deployed as a shield. What he got was none of those things. What he got was a pair of dark, completely steady eyes that looked at him the way you look at something you have seen before and already understand and are simply waiting to confirm. "Can I help you?" Officer James said. His voice was even unhurried and perfectly polite in the specific way that is not warmth, but is not provocation either. It was simply the absence of fear, which in Pruitt's experience was the one response he consistently did not know what to do with. Pruitt chewed his gum once. His eyes moved to the Mercedes outside. "Nice car out there." "That yours it is." Pruitt waited for more. Nothing came. James had returned his eyes to the page in front of him, not rudely, not dismissively, simply with the quiet confidence of a man who had answered the question that was asked and had nothing further to add until a further question warranted it. The absence of subservience landed on Pruitt like a splinter. "What brings you to Hargrove?" "Breakfast," James said without looking up, gesturing minimally toward the plate of cherry pie and the half-empty coffee cup. "Don't get smart with me." Pruitt's voice dropped to the register he used when he wanted people to understand that the pleasant portion of the interaction was over. "I asked you a question. You don't look like you're from around here." James set his pen down slowly and looked at Pruitt again. His eyes dropped briefly to the name tag on the uniform, then came back up. "I wasn't aware that Hargrove required a residency certificate to eat breakfast, Officer Pruitt." The use of his name, calm, precise, utterly unafraid, made Pruitt's jaw tighten in a way he couldn't entirely control. "We've had burglaries in the area," Pruitt said, shifting into the official justification that was never really a justification, but always sounded like one. "High-end neighborhoods, lots of suspicious activity. I'm going to need to see some ID." Diane, standing 20 feet away with the coffee carafe now back in her hand, heard those words and stopped moving entirely. She had heard Pruitt ask for ID before. She knew who he asked and who he didn't. The pattern was not complicated, and it was not subtle, and it had never once been about burglaries. At the booth, near the front window, Tyler Okafor reached into his backpack, pulled out his phone, and held it below the table's edge. He pressed record. His hands were not entirely steady, but his finger did not leave the button. James placed both hands flat on the table, not in surrender, but in the deliberate posture of a man who was about to be very precise and wanted his body language to match. "Am I being detained?" he asked. The question was 4 words, and the 4 words landed in the air between them like something that had been dropped from a height, because they were not the words of someone guessing at their rights. They were the words of someone who knew them completely, had argued them in court, and had helped write the statutes that defined them. Pruitt blinked. "Excuse me. It's a simple question, Officer Pruitt." James said, his voice carrying the same measured, unhurried quality. It always carried the quality of a man who understood that in moments like this, the person who stays calm holds all the leverage. "Am I being detained? Because if I am not being detained, I am free to continue my breakfast. And if I am being detained, I would like to know the specific articulable suspicion that justifies it as required by Terry versus Ohio, which I trust you're familiar with." The diner had gone very quiet. The 2 retirees at the neighboring table had lowered their newspapers. The couple near the wall had stopped eating. "Oidis ong." Greg, behind the counter, was pretending to wipe the same section of counter he had been wiping for the last 45 seconds. Pruitt's face had begun to color, not a flush of embarrassment, but the harder red of a man whose authority has been met with something it wasn't designed to handle. In 17 years, the people Pruitt chose to approach had never spoken to him like this. They had argued yes. They had cried plenty of times. They had sworn at him and occasionally tried to run. But they had never stood their ground, or in this case, sat their ground with the serene confidence of someone who not only knew the law, but lived inside it professionally. "You're refusing a lawful order from a police officer," Pruitt said, his voice tightening. "I'm asking whether I'm being detained," James replied. "Those are two different things." "Which is it, officer?" The color in Pruitt's face deepened. Diane watched from the counter. She had started to reach for her personal phone, not to film, but because something in the back of her mind, the part built from 2 years of watching Dale Pruitt move through this diner like he owned a piece of everyone in it, told her that this was not going to stay a conversation for very much longer, and that if it became something else, someone needed to be ready to do something about it. At his booth near the window, Tyler Okafor had shifted in his seat, so the camera angle was cleaner. He kept recording. The moment Pruitt realized the entire diner was watching him lose an argument, not a confrontation, not a takedown, not an investigation, but a simple back-and-forth exchange with a man eating cherry pie, was the moment the last functioning guardrail in his decision-making gave way. He had spent 17 years in this township building a reputation, and that was built entirely on the assumption that when he walked into a space, the energy in that space deferred to him. Instantly, automatically, without negotiation. He was the officer. He set the tone. Everyone else adjusted. That was the order of things, and it had held for so long that it had stopped feeling like a dynamic and had started feeling like a law of nature, as fixed and reliable as gravity. The man in the corner booth was not adjusting. Pruitt's hand came down hard on the table. The impact sent the coffee cup skidding sideways and knocked the briefcase partially off the vinyl seat beside James, and the coffee, dark, still warm, sloshed over the rim and spread across the table in a slow, inevitable tide, soaking directly into the stack of papers that had been lying open at Section 4, Paragraph 2, excessive use of force. The ink blurred, the margins filled with brown. The 47 pages of work that James Caldwell had spent 14 months building began to absorb the damage in a way that was to everyone watching so grotesquely perfect in its symbolism that no one in the room quite knew what to say. Diane did not move. Pruitt pointed at James. "Stand up. Right now. You are being detained for obstruction of a police investigation and failure to comply with a lawful order. Stand up, or I will make you stand up, and you will not enjoy the difference." James looked at the papers. He looked at the coffee spreading across them. Then he looked at Pruitt, and when his eyes came back up, they were completely, deeply, unusually calm, the calm of a man who has just watched something confirm everything he already knew and has decided not to waste the confirmation. He stood up slowly to his full 6 feet and 2 inches, and he raised his hands so they were plainly visible. Fingers open, nothing hidden, and he said in a voice that was low and perfectly clear and carrying, "I am complying with your physical instructions under protest. I am stating for your body camera record that this is an unlawful detention, that I have committed no crime, and that I am not resisting in any way." Pruitt grabbed his shoulder and spun him around toward the table. The second impact sent the rest of the coffee cup over the edge. The remaining papers followed, sliding off the table in a slow cascade, landing face up on the checkered tile, the text still barely legible under the spreading stain. Diane's coffee carafe touched down on the counter with a sound like a small bell. The handcuffs came off Pruitt's belt. Click, click. He tightened them one extra notch, deliberately, purposefully, the way a man does something when he wants the person it's being done to feel it. James did not make a sound. The diner door swung shut behind them with a sound that was too ordinary for what it was closing off. Through the front window, the remaining customers watched Pruitt march James across the parking lot toward the cruiser, and the tableau had a quality that everyone in the room recognized from somewhere, from the news, from history, from the particular corner of American life that people like the retirees with their newspapers had spent decades knowing about in the abstract and now had to know about in the specific in this diner at this hour over their eggs and coffee on a Tuesday morning that had not asked to be extraordinary. The older of the two retirees, a man named Gerald who had lived in Hargrove for 31 years and had voted for the police levy every time it came up, set his newspaper down very carefully on the table, as if he was trying not to make noise, and looked at his coffee cup for a long moment without drinking from it. Inside, Diane walked to the corner booth and stood at the edge of it. The papers were on the floor. She crouched down and gathered them page by page. The edges brown and soft from the coffee, some of the words blurred past reading. She stacked them as carefully as she could and placed them on the table. She looked at Tyler Okafor. "Tell me you got it," she said. Tyler turned the phone around so she could see the screen. Clear, steady, full audio. "Don't post it yet," Diane said, and there was something in her voice. Not panic, not even urgency, just a quiet certainty that surprised her a little. "I need to find out who he is first. I think this matters more than clicks." Tyler looked at her for a moment, then looked out the window at the cruiser pulling out of the parking lot. "He said his name," Tyler said quietly. "When Pruitt grabbed him, he said it clearly." Diane looked at him. "James Caldwell," Tyler said. The morning air in the Hargrove Grill parking lot was cool and bright, the kind of early autumn morning where the light is so clean it makes everything look slightly more exposed than it wants to be. And that quality of light fell without mercy on the scene unfolding near the black and white cruiser, an officer in tactical gear, pressing a handcuffed man in a charcoal suit against the passenger side of the vehicle, his hand pushing down on the small of the man's back, with the practiced ease of someone who had done this particular thing many times and had never once been asked to explain it afterward. Pruitt kicked James's feet apart, not a nudge. A kick sharp and deliberate, the kind designed to remind someone of their physical vulnerability, and began a rough pat-down that was more performance than procedure, his hands moving across James's jacket with the heavy confidence of a man who expected to find something and also, on some level, didn't care whether he did. James stood with his hands cuffed behind him and his cheek a half-inch from the metal of the cruiser door, and he did what he had been doing since the moment Pruitt's shadow first fell across his table. He counted, cataloged, memorized the number on the cruiser, the time on his watch before Pruitt had removed it and placed it on the hood, the name on the badge, the direction they had come from, the number of steps between the diner door and this vehicle. He was building something quietly and methodically in the space behind his eyes where his legal mind had lived and worked for 30 years, and the construction was going very well. A second cruiser whipped into the lot lights going and came to a hard stop 6 feet away. Officer Danny Reeves stepped out, 25, lean, still carrying the posture of someone who hadn't yet learned to slouch through a shift, his face arranged in the alert forward expression of a rookie who had hit the panic button call and was now trying to read a situation that wasn't giving him clean information. His eyes moved from Pruitt to the cruiser, to the handcuffed man in the expensive suit, to the gleaming Cadillac parked quietly nearby, and none of the pieces fit together into anything that made immediate sense. Mitch Reeves said, approaching. "What happened? What did he do?" "Non-compliant," Pruitt said without turning around, his hand still on James's back. "Refused ID. Obstruction. I'm running him in." Reeves looked at James again. James turned his head slightly, resting his cheek against the cool metal of the door, and looked directly at the young officer with eyes that were steady and clear and asked nothing and stated everything. Reeves took one more look at the Cadillac, one more look at the suit, one more look at the briefcase that had been left on the lot pavement when Pruitt had hauled James out of the diner. Something in his chest said, "This is wrong." He stepped closer. Mitch Reeves said, keeping his voice level, "Protocol says we identify before transport when we can. Let me check his pockets." Pruitt made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sneer, something in between. "Go ahead, check his fancy suit. Probably fake ID anyway." Reeves stepped up beside James. "Excuse me, sir," he said, and the "sir" was instinctive, reflexive, the product of a training that had tried to drill basic dignity into him, and it came out of him genuinely. "I'm going to reach into your inside left breast pocket. Is that where your identification is?" "It is," James said. Reeves reached into the jacket, his fingers finding the wallet by feel-thick leather premium, and drew it out. He flipped it open. It was not a driver's license. It was not a credit card holder or a business card case or any of the ordinary things that live in ordinary wallets. It was a card the color of gold embossed with the seal of the state legislature at the top left corner, bearing a photograph and a name and a title in letters that were not large but were extremely unmistakably clear. State Senate Senator James Caldwell, Chair, Judiciary Committee. Reeves read it once. He read it a second time. The third time, he was not reading it so much as staring at it, waiting for it to say something different, because the thing it was currently saying was something that his 25-year-old brain, trained for 6 months at the police academy, was not fully equipped to process, while standing in a parking lot in the bright Tuesday morning sun with the man in the photograph currently handcuffed to his left. His hands began to shake. "Mitch," he said, and his voice had changed entirely, had gone from calm and procedural to something thin and brittle. "Mitch." "He got warrants," Pruitt said, still not turning around. "Tell me he's got warrants." Reeves held the wallet out so it was visible to Pruitt's peripheral vision. "Mitch, look at me. Look at this." Pruitt turned. He looked at the gold card. He read the name. He read the title. And then, in the moment that would define the rest of his professional life, the rest of his legal life, the rest of the story of who Dale Pruitt was, he reached over and took the wallet out of Reeves's hand, and he pressed it into his own vest pocket, and he turned back to the cruiser. "Nobody is above the law," Pruitt said. His voice was flat and strange, the voice of a man reciting something he used to believe and was now using as a lifeline because he couldn't think of anything else to hold on to. "He's going in." Reeves stared at him. "Mitch," he said very quietly. "What are you doing?" Pruitt opened the cruiser's rear door and put his hand on James's head. "Watch your head," he said. Pruitt walked around to the driver's side and got in. The door closed. Reeves stood in the parking lot with the morning sun coming down on him and the realization coming down on him too slower and heavier that he had just watched his senior officer read a state senator's credentials and put them in his own pocket and proceed anyway, which was not a mistake and was not an oversight. It was a choice made consciously in daylight, in front of a witness. He pulled out his personal phone, not his radio, and found Sergeant Garfield's direct number. Inside the cruiser, Pruitt drove. He drove the way he drove when his nerves were bad, a little too fast on the straightaways corners taken tighter than necessary, the energy going somewhere through the accelerator because it had nowhere else to go. In the rearview mirror, the man in the back seat sat perfectly upright, his hands behind his back, looking out the side window with the patient, observational quality of someone conducting a survey. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't crying. He wasn't begging. Pruitt hated that more than anything else that had happened this morning. He tried to think it through. The union had covered worse. The previous captain had signed off on situations that made this look minor. The judges in Hargrove County had taken his word as testimony for 17 years without asking too many questions. There had been that kid Devin Wade 18 months ago, and the situation had been messier than Pruitt liked to admit even to himself. But it had been handled. It had been filed away. The DA had moved forward, and the kid's lawyer had been outgunned. And that was how things worked. That was how they had always worked, and there was no reason this would be different. He reached for that logic and found it, and it held his weight for about 30 seconds. And then he thought about the name on the gold card. Chair, Judiciary Committee. The committee that was voting on the use of force bill in 8 days. The committee that had the power to freeze departmental funding. That oversaw the certification of every officer in the state. That if its chairman had a reason to look very carefully at the Hargrove Township Police Department's last 17 years of complaint files, Pruitt's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He did not finish the thought. He pressed the accelerator and turned into the precinct's rear entrance and told himself that the union would handle it the way it always had. He was going to be wrong about that. Diane stood at the front window of Hargrove Grill and watched the cruiser turn right onto Millbrook Avenue and disappear. And then she stood there for another few seconds after it was gone because she wasn't ready to turn around yet, wasn't ready to go back to the coffee carafe and the customers and the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning shift, because what had just happened in this diner was not ordinary, and she was old enough at 22 to know that pretending ordinary was a choice with consequences. She turned around. The remaining customers were looking at her the way people look at someone they've appointed without asking to do something on their behalf, a collective unspoken delegation of responsibility that she hadn't agreed to and couldn't refuse. She walked to Tyler Okafor's booth. He had the phone face up on the table. The video paused on a frame that showed Pruitt's hand coming down on the diner table and the coffee beginning to crest the edge of the cup, and in the foreground, slightly out of focus, the first page of the reform bill. "Good angle," Diane said. "I've been told I'm good at noticing things other people miss," Tyler said, which was true, and which his mother said to him every time his report card came back, and every teacher had written some version of perceptive, observational, thoughtful in the comments column. "Don't post it yet," Diane said. "James Caldwell. You're sure that's the name?" "I'm sure." Diane went to the back of the diner past the kitchen to the small break room where the staff kept their personal phones during shifts. She found hers and typed the name into her browser. The results came back in 0.4 seconds. She stood looking at the screen for a long moment. Then she walked back out to the diner floor, picked up the coffee carafe, and began refilling cups with the steady hands of someone who has just understood exactly how important the next few hours are going to be. The rear entrance of the Hargrove Township Police Department smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, and the particular institutional staleness that accumulates in buildings where the fluorescent lights never fully dim and the paperwork never fully stops. Pruitt brought James through the heavy steel door and down the short corridor to the booking area, his hand on James's elbow. Not gentle, not aggressive, just present the touch of a man who wanted to make sure the person he was holding understood they were being held. Sergeant Lou Garfield was at the booking desk. He was 58 years old and had been doing this job for 30 of those years and had 3 months left before a retirement that he had been quietly, carefully planning in the way that people plan things they're afraid to want too badly in case they don't come true. He had a good pension. He had a woodworking shop in his garage. He had a wife who had put up with 30 years of his schedule and deserved the version of him that showed up for dinner on time. He was not at this point in his life looking for complications. He looked up from his sports magazine. He saw a man in a charcoal suit with a chalk stripe, hands cuffed behind him, coffee stains across the front of his jacket, standing with the posture of someone who had not been diminished in the slightest by any of the things that were designed to diminish him. The man's face was calm. His shoulders were back. His eyes, when they met Garfield's, were clear and steady and carried something that Garfield's 30 years on the job translated automatically and correctly as, "I know exactly where I am and why and what comes next." "What have we got?" Garfield asked, setting down his magazine. "Burglary profile, obstruction, failure to comply." Pruitt said, marching James to the counter. "No ID, no cooperation." Running him through. Garfield looked at James again. His 30-year instinct said wrong. This is very wrong. He could not have explained it precisely, but the instinct was louder than his willingness to ignore it. "Name?" he asked, looking at James directly. The rear door banged open before James could answer. Officer Danny Reeves came through it at a speed that was not quite running, but was the fastest a man can move when he is trying not to look like he is running, and his face was the color of someone who has been outside in the cold too long, and when he saw Garfield, he stopped and grabbed the edge of the booking counter with both hands. "Sarge," he said, breathing harder than the distance warranted, "don't book him. Don't enter him in the system. Stop." Garfield's hand came off his keyboard. "Reeves, what on earth? No probable cause." Reeves said, his voice dropping slightly the way voices drop when people are saying things they understand have weight. "I was there. The whole thing. He had nothing." "Pruitt." He stopped himself. He looked at James. "Sir, tell him your name. Tell him exactly." James took one step forward, his cuffed hands behind him, and looked at Lou Garfield with the level, unhurried directness of a man who has had to say his name in rooms where it was not known and make it known by the manner in which he said it. "My name is Senator James Caldwell," he said. "I chair the state's Judiciary Committee. I was eating breakfast in a public diner, and your officer handcuffed me without cause and transported me here against my will." The color left Lou Garfield's face the way water leaves a container all at once and completely. He knew that name. He had watched the budget hearings 3 months ago on the precinct's break room television. He had heard that name attached to the pension restructuring language that affected every officer in the state. He had, in the small, quiet part of his mind, that he kept honest thought, "That's a decent man doing something hard." He looked at Dale Pruitt. "Mitch," he said, and his voice had gone very flat. "Tell me you didn't." Pruitt's jaw tightened. He refused a lawful order, Sarge. "I followed procedure. "The Union will, the Union," Garfield said, and the flatness in his voice had calcified into something colder, "is not the name you should be saying to me right now." He pushed back from the desk and stood up, which he did not do often, and pointed at the radio on the wall. "Get Captain Hess down here. Not in 5 minutes. Right now." He turned to his computer terminal and began typing, not booking entry, but the opposite of it, the lockdown protocol for body camera footage, the one that preserves server data against deletion. His fingers moved with the speed of a man who understood that the window for doing the right thing was open and getting smaller, and he was not going to be the person who let it close. Pruitt tried again. "I'm telling you, the man was uncooperative. He made it adversarial from the start. He cited case law at me in the middle of a—" "He cited case law," Garfield repeated, and he stopped typing for exactly 1 second to look at Pruitt. And what was in his eyes was not anger. It was something quieter and more final than anger. The look of a man who has spent 30 years in a profession that he took seriously and is watching someone make it into a thing that shames him. He cited case law. In a diner. "And you handcuffed him." Pruitt opened his mouth. "Don't," Garfield said. Nora Hess came through the door from the stairwell at a pace that indicated she had moved fast, getting here despite the dignity she was trying to project, and she stopped in the middle of the booking room and took in the tableau, Pruitt rigid near the wall, Reeves braced near the door, Garfield behind the desk, and the man in the stained suit standing at the center of all of it, with the posture of a marble column, and something in her face rearranged itself in the way faces rearrange when they are registering the specific kind of disaster that does not stay local. She knew James Caldwell's face. She had shaken his hand at the law enforcement funding gala in April and been impressed by how he listened. Before she could speak, the outer door banged open a second time, and Walt Brecker filled the frame, 62 years old, the regional director of the Police Benevolent Association, a bulldog of a man in a gray suit that had been good once and was now just familiar, carrying a soft-sided briefcase and the confident momentum of someone accustomed to arriving in rooms and making problems go away. He didn't look at James. He never looked at the complainant. First, it was habit strategy, a way of establishing that the civilian in the room was not the point. "Captain Hess," he said, his voice carrying the blunt assurance of someone used to being the loudest person in any room he chose to enter. "I'm formally invoking my client's Garrity rights. No questioning without union counsel present. And pulling his badge without a formal hearing is a direct violation of—" He stopped, because he had finally looked at the man in the stained suit. He looked at James Caldwell. He looked for a long time. Nora Hess said quietly and precisely, "Walter, that is Senator James Caldwell, chairman of the Judiciary Committee." The transformation that moved through Walt Brecker's face in the 10 seconds after Hess said those words was remarkable in its completeness, not because he was a man capable of shame exactly, but because he was a man perfectly capable of mathematics, and the calculation he was running was fast and accurate, and arrived at a result that made his bluster simply cease to exist, the way a fire ceases to exist when someone removes all the oxygen. Brecker had represented officers in difficult situations for 22 years. He had sat across from internal affairs investigators and smiled while his clients described their version of events that contradicted video witness testimony and basic plausibility. He was good at his job in the way that a lockpick is good at its job, technical, specific, and morally neutral regarding whatever door it was opening. He had always operated from the assumption that no matter how bad something looked, the blue wall was structural enough to hold. But this was not a complainant with a lawyer and a civil suit. This was not a community organizer with a social media following. This was the man who chaired the committee that wrote the law that governed everything. Brecker's union was protected by the pension language, the certification standards, the indemnification structures, all of it. And he was standing in this booking room with coffee stains on his suit and red marks on his wrists from cuffs that Dale Pruitt had tightened one extra notch for no professional reason at all. Brecker took a step backward. It was a small step, maybe 4 inches. But every person in the room noticed it because it was the step of a man who had just decided that there was a line he was not going to cross and that his client was on the other side of it and that the line was now closed. He did not look at Pruitt. That was the worst part. That was the part that Pruitt would remember longer than the handcuff sounds and longer than the gold card and longer than the governor's voice on the phone. Walt Brecker, who had stood beside Pruitt in 3 internal affairs hearings and looked the investigators in the eye and said, "My client acted within the scope of his training and his professional discretion did not look at him." He took a step back and then another, and he moved toward the door with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man ensuring that no one could describe his exit as a retreat. He paused at the door. He said to no one in particular, and to the room at large, "I'll need to consult with my organization's legal team before any further involvement." He left. The door swung shut behind him with a sound that was very ordinary and very final. Pruitt stood against the wall of the booking room and looked at the people in it, Garfield at his terminal, typing not looking up, Reeves near the back wall looking at the floor, Hess with her phone already at her ear. The senator standing at the center of everything watching Pruitt with the patient diagnostic attention of a man who has just seen a mechanism reveal the full extent of how it works. Not one person in the room looked at Pruitt the way a colleague looks at another colleague. For the first time in 17 years, Dale Pruitt had no one standing beside him. "Get the senator's briefcase," Hess said to Reeves, and Reeves was gone and back in under 2 minutes, moving at the speed of someone who understood that every correct action he took now was being observed and recorded, not just by cameras, but by the particular quality of attention that a senator who chairs a judiciary committee brings to a room where he has been wronged. He handed the briefcase to James with both hands, an instinctive gesture of care that James noticed and filed. James set the case on the booking counter and clicked the brass latches open. The papers were inside the ones Reeves had recovered from the parking lot, pavement stacked unevenly, edges soft from the coffee. Multiple pages blurred past legibility. James looked at them without touching them for a moment, in the way that a person looks at something damaged that they put a great deal of themselves into, and then he set them aside without comment. He found his phone. 14 unread messages from his staff. 3 missed calls from his senior policy advisor, 1 from the governor's office marked as received at 8:47 a.m., which meant they had been trying to reach him for over an hour. He ignored all of it, scrolled to a contact, saved under initials only, and pressed call. The room had gone quiet. Not the quiet of people being polite, the quiet of people who have stopped pretending to do other things and are simply watching, because whatever was about to happen was going to matter in a way that the ordinary business of a Tuesday morning at the Hargrove Township Police Department was not going to matter, not for a long time, possibly not ever. Pruitt still against the wall, still stripped of his badge and his weapon and his union representative and every other layer of insulation that had kept him safe for 17 years, watched James press the phone to his ear. He thought about the name on the gold card. He thought about the Devin Wade file. He thought about what it would mean if someone with the authority to open that file decided to open it. He felt the floor shift slightly beneath him, the way floors do in dreams right before you realize you are standing on nothing. James spoke into the phone. "This is Senator Caldwell. Please put me through to the governor immediately." The chief of staff answered on the second ring. "Senator Caldwell, we've been trying to reach you since 8. The committee is waiting. Governor Osee has asked about you twice already." "I understand," James said, and his voice in that moment was the voice of a man who has not lost his composure, has not been diminished, and has in fact spent the last 90 minutes accumulating something that composure alone could never buy. "Please patch me through to the governor right now. It's urgent, and it's directly related to what she'll be discussing at the committee session." A brief pause. 1 moment. The hold music lasted 4 seconds. "James." Governor Patricia Osee's voice came through with the warm, businesslike directness of a woman who managed 17 simultaneous crises on a daily basis and had developed a 6th sense for when the 18th one was arriving. "We're holding the committee for you. Tell me you're in the car." Patricia James said, and every person in the booking room heard the use of the first name and understood what it meant about the nature of the relationship between the man they were looking at and the woman on the other end of the line. "I am standing in the booking room of the Hargrove Township Police Department. 90 minutes ago, I was physically assaulted and handcuffed without probable cause in a public diner by one of their officers while eating breakfast. I was transported here against my will. My wrists are bruised, my legislative documents have been destroyed, and the officer who did this read my Senate credentials after the fact and proceeded with the arrest anyway." The silence on the other end of the line lasted 3 full seconds. When Governor Osei spoke again, the warm, businesslike directness was gone, replaced by something different, something colder and more precise. The voice not of a woman managing a crisis, but of the highest executive authority in the state, making a series of rapid, irrevocable decisions. "Put the phone on speaker and set it on the counter," she said. James tapped the speaker icon and set the phone on the booking desk. "Who is the commanding officer present?" the governor asked, and the voice filled the booking room, the way sound fills a space when no one is making any competing sound at all. Hess stepped forward. "Captain Nora Hess, Governor." "Captain Hess, you have 60 seconds to explain to me why my Judiciary Committee chairman is standing in your booking room with bruised wrists, or I am going to dispatch the State Police Tactical Division to relieve you of your command and assume operational control of your facility. The clock starts now." Hess explained. It took 50 seconds. She was concise and accurate, and did not minimize anything, because she was smart enough to understand that minimizing anything in front of this woman right now was not an available strategy. "Officer Pruitt is suspended pending investigation," she concluded. "Suspended," the governor repeated, and the single word carried the specific register of someone for whom that response was almost too inadequate to bother correcting. "Captain, this man didn't write a bad report. He assaulted a sitting state senator in a public diner and then read his credentials and chose to continue. That is a criminal act committed under the color of law. I am dispatching Attorney General Adeyemi to your location right now. No one leaves that building. No one touches the body camera server. If a single frame of footage is missing when he arrives, I will pursue obstruction charges against every officer in that facility. Are we clear?" "Yes," Governor Hess said. "Completely." A pause. "Then Dale Pruitt, is he in the room?" Hess looked at Pruitt. "Yes, ma'am." "Mr. Pruitt," the governor said. Pruitt's jaw worked once. "Yes. I am the governor of this state. I want you to understand that the next thing you say in this room, in this building, or to any media outlet will be a part of the official record of a federal civil rights investigation. I strongly advise you to say nothing further until an attorney of your choosing, who will not be the union representative who has already left, is present. Do you understand?" Pruitt's mouth opened. It closed. He said nothing. "Good," the governor said. "James, I'll have Adeyemi there in 20 minutes. I'm sorry this happened to you." "I know," James said. "I'm fine. Let's make sure it matters." The call ended. The Attorney General arrived in 18 minutes, which was faster than the 20 the governor had estimated, and which suggested that Robert Adeyemi had begun moving before the phone call was fully over, a detail that was not lost on anyone in the building who understood how state government worked. He came in 3 black SUVs with 4 state troopers in full uniform, and he walked through the precinct's front entrance at a speed that was not running, but was its close relative, the purposeful, forward-leaning stride of a man whose time carries weight. He was 51 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and the specific kind of focused calm that serious authority produces in people who were already serious before they had it. He bypassed Hess, bypassed Garfield, bypassed every other person in the room, and walked directly to James Caldwell. He extended his hand. "Senator, the governor briefed me. I apologize for the time it took." They shook hands, and the handshake visible to everyone in the booking area said something that no formal statement could have said as efficiently. The Attorney General of the state had arrived and was deferring to the man who had been handcuffed 2 hours ago. Pruitt, against the wall, watched this. The troopers secured the building. Garfield provided the body camera drive in its sealed evidence bag. Adeyemi took it personally, checked the seal, and handed it to one of his troopers. They set up in the precinct's upstairs briefing room, a utilitarian space designed for morning roll calls with a projection screen that was pulled down from the ceiling, and a media port that Garfield connected to the drive with steady, deliberate hands. James sat in the front row, arms crossed, watching. Adeyemi sat beside him. Behind them, Hess, Garfield, Reeves. In the center of the room, in a hard plastic chair flanked by 2 state troopers, sat Dale Pruitt. The room lights dimmed. The footage began. It started with the diner, the wide-angle view from Pruitt's body camera, the black and white tile floor, the corner booth. The audio was clear with the ambient quality of a room in which ordinary things were happening until they stopped happening. A man reading documents, a coffee cup, a cherry pie. They heard Pruitt's opening questions. They heard James's responses. 4 words, 8 words. The careful, measured language of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and was doing it precisely. They heard the hand hit the table. They heard the coffee cup tip. They heard the handcuffs. Adeyemi was writing on his legal pad in the dark, his pen moving steadily. And then the footage moved to the parking lot, and they watched Pruitt reach into James's jacket, and they watched Pruitt read the gold card, and they watched Pruitt put the wallet in his own vest pocket, and they watched the rear door of the cruiser close. Several people in the room had stopped breathing without realizing it. Then the in-car footage began a separate recording, the camera mounted above the partition, and they heard Pruitt's voice as he drove. And they heard him say to the empty front seat, and the dash camera, he appeared to have forgotten, was recording, "We'll handle this like the Devin Wade situation. Write it up right. Judges in this county have taken my word for 17 years. Not about to stop now." The room went so quiet that the hum of the projector was audible. Adeyemi stopped writing. He looked at Hess. "Devin Wade. I want that file on my desk before I leave this building." Hess nodded, and her face had the look of someone who had just watched a door open that she had not known was there, and was not sure she wanted to know what was behind it. James stood up. He walked across the room to where Pruitt was sitting in the plastic chair between the two state troopers, and he stood in front of the man. Not over him, not looming, just standing, the way you stand in front of something you want to look at, clearly. And he said in the same voice he had used in the diner, the same voice he had used in the parking lot, the same voice he had maintained throughout every part of this morning. "You didn't just stop me from getting to work, Officer Pruitt. You showed me exactly what I've been writing about. Every section, every paragraph. You were the proof I didn't know I needed." Pruitt looked at the floor. Adeyemi spoke from the front of the room. "Officer Dale Pruitt, you are under arrest for false imprisonment, assault under the color of law, official misconduct, and conspiracy to obstruct justice." The troopers stepped forward. The handcuffs came out. They clicked onto Pruitt's wrists, the same sound, the same metal, a weight that now belonged to someone entirely different than it had 2 hours ago. Nobody in the room needed to say anything about that. The front door of the Hargrove Township Police Department opened onto the late morning sun, which had climbed considerably higher since the day began and was now casting everything in the flat, honest light of a day that had already made up its mind about what kind of day it was going to be. James stepped out. His Cadillac was at the curb. Danny Reeves had driven it over from the diner lot without being asked, a small act of restitution that required no instruction and communicated clearly what kind of officer he intended to be going forward. Reeves was standing beside it. He held the keys out with both hands. "Senator, I should have." "You acted when it counted," James said. "You came back. That's not a small thing." He took the keys. "When this department is restructured, and it will be, I'll remember that you came back." Reeves gave a short nod, the nod of someone trying to hold on to something without making it obvious how much they need to hold on to it. James turned toward the car and stopped. Diane was standing on the sidewalk near the passenger side, still in her Hargrove Grill uniform. Her shift apparently ended or handed off, and she was holding the stack of water-stained, coffee-blurred pages, the reform bill, or what remained of it, that she had gathered from the diner floor and carried here by some instinct she couldn't have fully explained. She held them out to him. "You left these." James looked at the papers. 47 pages of closely argued law, the margins full of his handwriting, several pages completely illegible, now the first page carrying a dark brown stain that spread across the header and the opening paragraph and bled down into section 1 as though the morning had left its own annotation. He took them from her. "Thank you, Diane," he said. He had remembered her name from the first moment she'd given it, and the fact that he said it now, without effort, without performance, was the thing that finally made her eyes go bright. James sat in the driver's seat with the door closed and the engine not yet running, and the damaged papers on the passenger seat beside him. The car was quiet. The morning outside continued at its ordinary pace, a delivery truck pulling into the lot across the street, a woman walking a dog, the light changing at the corner, without any particular drama. He looked at the stained pages and thought about the 14 months it had taken to write them, all the hearings and revisions and late nights and compromises and the particular exhaustion of trying to change something that does not want to be changed. And then he thought about the last 2 hours, which had been brutal and clarifying in equal measure. He picked up the gold pen from the cup holder, the same pen he had been using at the diner when the morning was still ordinary, and he opened the first page of the bill to the header below the title just above the water damage, and he signed his name. Not the official signature, not the signature that would appear on the enrolled version when the legislature passed it, but the private personal mark of a man who wanted to remember exactly what these pages had been through before they became law. He put the pen away. He sat with it for another moment. Then he turned the key. At the diner, Tyler Okafor had been sitting in the same booth for the better part of 2 hours, his oatmeal long cold, his orange juice untouched, the phone still in his hand. The video was 31 seconds long, clear, audio-steady frame the moment Pruitt's hand came down and the coffee crested the cup edge. And the papers took the damage, all of it, in one unbroken take. He had not posted it. Not because Diane had told him not to, but because somewhere in the past 2 hours he had decided that the video was a document, not a performance, and that the question of what you do with something true when you have it is a more serious question than it looks from the outside. He scrolled through the footage one more time, watching the part where James stood up, slow, deliberate hands plainly raised, and something about that image, the specific quality of that calmness in the face of that rage, settled into him in a way that he thought might take years to fully understand. He saved the video into a folder he titled Evidence Not Content, and then he put the phone in his backpack, picked up his things, and went to school. He was 40 minutes late. He didn't have an explanation that his homeroom teacher was going to understand immediately, but he thought he'd try. The highway back toward the Capitol moved steadily in the late morning, the way highways do when rush hour has cleared, but the day hasn't peaked yet, and James drove in the quiet lane at a reasonable speed, with the stained papers on the seat beside him, and his right hand on the wheel, and his left resting on the door, where the sun came through the window and warmed his skin. The red mark on his left wrist from the handcuffs had faded to a faint pink, still visible if you knew to look. He did not put his sleeve down to cover it. He was going to walk into the committee chamber with it showing with the water-stained bill in his hand, and he was going to call the vote. Today, not next week, not after further deliberation today, because the thing about a morning like this one is that it does not leave room for the argument that the problem is complicated and the timing isn't right, and maybe we should wait a little longer. Dale Pruitt had made that argument impossible to make. And whatever else the man had done wrong this morning, that James Caldwell thought, as the Capitol's skyline appeared on the horizon, was the one thing he had done exactly right. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories about dignity, justice, and the people who fight for both.